Hi, everybody. Make sure you can hear me. All right, well, thank you so much for inviting me to participate today. It's been really wonderful to listen to colleagues from across the country. It's, I think, both comforting and distressing that a lot of what we're talking about feels very familiar to me. So I think sometimes we come to things like this and we hope somebody's got the answer. And it's that we're all struggling with these issues and trying to figure out the best way to deal with it. So I also want to bring gratitude from Mayor Frey. Affordable housing is his #1 priority for his administration. We love to talk about the work that we're doing in Minneapolis and really care about sharing it so that other people can learn from what we're doing and what's worked and what we're still fussing around with. So, I have a lot of slides. I'm going to try to blow through a lot of them because I think you guys' questions have been great, so I want to leave a lot of time for that. So, closer to the mic? Yes. All right. Is that better? Yes? Okay. All right. Feel free to do that if I come away from it a little bit. So I'm going to start out with some context for Minneapolis, which is not going to be that different from, I think, some of the context we've been talking about here in Tacoma and also in Denver. So the housing trends, we're growing faster than we have since 1950. Our population in the 2010 census was around 380,000. In the estimates in 2018, we're 425,000. So we've grown over 40,000 in population in the last less than 10 years, and we expect that growth to be even more increased in this upcoming census. So we've got a lot of people who want to live in Minneapolis. We're really proud of that, but it brings another level of challenges. Our population of color is growing faster than the population as a whole. And for a growing number of our low-income residents, the incomes are not keeping pace with the housing cost increases, and that's especially true for the people of color in our community. We also are now a majority renter population, and we have less affordable housing than we did 15 years ago. Production's not keeping up with that loss. Our racial disparities persist in all aspects of housing, and our geographic patterns of income and racial disparities are influenced by past discriminatory policy. So that's true in Minneapolis and really across the country. So here's just to show you some of those trends. We're now 53% renter in Minneapolis. That we sort of converged in 2010 and it becoming more and more renter. That's both low-income households and high-income households, which is also a national trend. So you can see here the status as broken out by race and ethnicity. So our white neighbors in Minneapolis are much more likely to be homeowners than our communities of color. And that's especially true for our Black and Indigenous populations. They see the lowest rates of homeownership in our population. Here are the incomes by race and ethnicity. You see again where the white population has a significantly higher income than other ethnic groups. And again, you see that the Black and Indigenous neighbors are have the lowest incomes. And then cost burden, which is something that a lot of people have talked about today already. We have a total cost burden amongst our population of 33%. And as you can see by these graphs, the further you get down the income spectrum, the higher the cost burden is. And we have 84% of our households at 30% of AMI or below that are cost burden. So what does this mean for us? So we in Minneapolis have over the years gotten a lot of press about being the best place to raise a family, great affordability, lots of opportunity, our Great Lakes, our great park system. All that is true, but there's always a caveat, and that caveat is unless you are Black and Indigenous. So that's something that we have been actively trying to address. This is a conversation that I think needs to happen nationally, is happening nationally, but is hard for people to have. So we talk about housing and the racial disparities in very general terms and in very race-neutral terms. And we in Minneapolis have taken a different tact to that, where we have begun to address some of those things a little bit more head-on, which for our Stoic Scandinavian history is a little unusual, but we're doing it. So the Minneapolis 2040 plan, which probably a lot of you have heard about at least a little bit, we've gotten a lot of national press on it. We really are focusing on undoing barriers and overcoming inequities that have been created by a history of policy in our cities. So there is a project in Minneapolis called the Mapping Prejudice Project that's led by Professor Kristen Delegard at the University of Minnesota. And she's done really amazing work about bringing this history and that it's our governmental and public policies that have gotten us to where we are today. And this has been really a building block for where we were able to go with our Minneapolis 2040 plan. So it starts out with racial covenants. So we know we had big parts of our city that were under racial covenants that were restricted, specifically blacks and Jews in some neighborhoods and Caucasians in other neighborhoods. That's also true across the country. I think what's happened differently in Minneapolis in this context is that we had this really graphical representation that was brought forward. So there were some museums that did a representation of actually mapping and showing these covenants that really brought the issue to the forefront. So first we started out with the covenants. Then that was around the early 1900s. Then we have the redlining maps, which again occurred across the country. You can see here in Minneapolis how those maps divided up. North Minneapolis, northeast, and then sort of central Minneapolis were the areas that were predominantly redlined. And then after redlining, we moved to zoning. So this is in the 50s. And you can see, this one's a little bit harder to see in this scale, but you can see that those same neighborhoods are the neighborhoods that have any kind of density, and the neighborhoods to the south and to the north are the neighborhoods that were zoned for what the legend refers to as residence, which is single-family homes. So it should be no surprise that when you layer those on top of each other and you see where we are today, that we have a very similar response. So the neighborhoods where our communities of color live are the neighborhoods that they were restricted to living in at those times. Those are still the neighborhoods that provide any level of affordability. And that just continues to be exacerbated by our zoning policies. So when you have whole parts of the city that were zoned for single family, and they were also public policy that kept people of color out, you can see why we have our home ownership rates that are widely divergent amongst our different communities. So what does this have to do with our planning, our comprehensive plan? So this Mapping Prejudice project became something that we really brought to the forefront and that we really started talking about as a city government, the mayor, the city council, as a part of a ramp up to this comprehensive plan that has to be submitted to our regional council. We really used it as an opportunity to start that conversation. So that we had a lot of community engagement, and that community engagement was really varied. So not just the typical sort of town hall, a room like this with a lot of people standing in a microphone, a lot of smaller conversations with our neighborhood associations, with other neighborhood groups at community centers and culturally relevant locations for our communities of color, and really had this conversation about what is our history and how do we take responsibility for it and how do we move forward. Through that process, there was a group that was formed called Neighbors for More Neighbors, which was a really important part of the ability to move this all forward. So these all conversations beg the question, if single-family zoning has been the latest iteration of how we keep our community segregated, can we eliminate single-family zoning? Which is a very fraught question, not without controversy. So the Minneapolis 2040 plan so the goal of the Minneapolis 2040 plan is to, in the housing arena, is to expand housing options for Minneapolis residents. And that means more types of housing and more affordability in every neighborhood in the city. So the plan was designed to support building more housing, So just in general, as I mentioned, we've grown over 40,000 residents in a short period of time. Our building permit numbers are at all-time highs, but we cannot keep up with the housing supply. I was jealous of the vacancy rates that were up there earlier, in the 6 to 9 to 10, we've been hovering at about 2 to 4% vacancy rate in Minneapolis for a long time. So, a 5% vacancy rate is considered relatively balanced, and we have been significantly under that. So in Minneapolis, we need more housing. We also need to be able to build less expensive housing. The housing costs, that's been mentioned already today, housing costs continue to go up for a variety of reasons. How do we make housing less expensive? One way to do that is to build a different variety of housing. And so to be able to allow that within our regulatory system helps to make that possible. And then we need to make sure that that less expensive housing is more affordable and is available in all neighborhoods throughout the city. So we really framed our affordable housing problem as a racial equity issue, because it is. And so part of the solution for reducing racial disparities is increasing both housing supply and housing choice. So what does that look like? So in terms of substantial supply, that's where we're talking about some of the more downtown core, some of the denser neighborhoods that are denser already, and really building that substantial supply. So looking to have larger buildings that are producing a lot of units. And then the other side is the incremental supply, which allows for more choice. So in other neighborhoods, how do we continue to expand what was a single-family neighborhood? How do we expand the options there? So in our inner neighborhoods, these are the neighborhoods that are close to downtown. We already have a mix of housing types in those neighborhoods. It was a period of time before the GI Bill and post-World War II housing boom that we were building more integrated neighborhoods in terms of housing stock. So that exists in Minneapolis. But then a history of downzoning over time has sort of frozen that. And so we had some apartment buildings with some single-family homes with some duplexes, et cetera, but you couldn't really build anything new to those same kinds of standards the way that the current zoning code was. So the approach here in these inner neighborhoods is to redo the zoning to be really considerate of things like commercial corridors that can that a lot of density can be easily incorporated into, making sure that we're doing density around transit corridors. And so the 2040 plan has a lot of different maps that redo the zoning in different areas based on those kinds of considerations. And then there's the outer neighborhoods, and these are the neighborhoods that I mentioned earlier, which are on the northern and the southern tip of Minneapolis that had been fairly exclusively single-family zoning. So this is where we've gotten all the national attention. What is the big deal with a triplex? Which also, during this period, were affectionately or not so affectionately referred to as Freiplexes after my boss, Mayor Jacob Frey. So originally the plan called for up to 4 units allowed by right under the zoning on any sort of standard lot in the city. Through the conversations and the community engagement and the inevitable political calculations that have to go on in order to move something like this forward, we ultimately came down to 3 units. And some of that also had to do with the structure of a lot. Because what we want to do right now, and before this in Minneapolis, you could have a pretty substantial size lot. You can build a substantial, large single-family home. So the idea was you could still build that single-family home, or you could build a duplex. It has similar height restrictions, FAR restrictions. So it's not zoning anarchy. We're not throwing out all the zoning laws. But you could choose to build a single-family home, or you could choose to build up to 3 units. So if once we got up to 4 units, some of those dynamics of what the scale of a building on a single lot changed. So the community engagement here was challenging, to say the least, but I think the decision to ground our work and our history and what we have done wrong in the past and what we're trying to do right in the future really created a framework that got people talking about it in a different way. And I'll also say that there were some benefits of some of our earlier policies and incrementalism that led us to being able to do this. One of which was the adoption of an accessory dwelling unit ordinance a year earlier. So once people started to imagine, like, okay, I could have an accessory dwelling unit in my backyard, that's 2 units, oh, maybe 1 more unit, that's not really wholesale change of the neighborhood, that still feels something within the realm of what I can understand in this context. So how do we ultimately get it done? The civic engagement, as I mentioned a couple times now, is a really important part. Over 150 meetings with thousands of residents, business owners, and community members. This sort of grassroots groundswell of neighbors who really were talking about this at the school, at the grocery store, the bus stop, on the train, and really talking about, like, what does this mean and how can we make sure that we are thinking about our neighbors, and that we want everybody to have a safe, affordable, dignified place to live in Minneapolis, and that we want more people to live in Minneapolis. It's a great place, and we want more people to continue to live there. So that was an important part of it. Setting really clear goals was another really important part of it, to make sure that people understood what we were trying to do, that it was very clear. The plan itself is very large, so trying to distill that down into really clear goals that people can understand is important. And the advocacy from the community groups that were supportive was a critical component. But I think the main thing that really gets it over the edge is the leadership. You are not going to win every heart and mind in a community engagement process. There's going to be people who want to see the status quo. There's going to be people who want you to do a lot more than what you're doing. So what really was a key thing here was that there was a leadership on the city council, who you can see in the slide, and the mayor, that they really believed in this work that we were doing. They really believed in affordability and increasing that in the city. The process of the comprehensive plan was about a 3-year process, and around year 2 was an election. So that's really scary for a lot of people, and that can really change the dynamic and make something like this, 2 years of work really go out the window for the planners and their long-range planning department that were working on it. But the council who was elected, the mayor was elected, and he was a council member at the time. He was elected to mayor during that period. They ran on affordable housing. And so when they were elected, they felt like they had a mandate from the community to do something different, to really try to move the needle. So I think that's my biggest takeaway on, like, how can you make something like this work, is that you really need the political leadership that's willing to stand up to do that. Okay, so that was the plan. That's the thing we've been getting a lot of press about. But a plan is a plan. And until you implement it, it's not going to create any more housing units for anybody. It's not going to address our racial disparities. So our goal is to expand housing options for Minneapolis residents, more housing in every neighborhood of the city. But how do we do that? So we knew with the 2040 plan that we couldn't just increase the zoning, and then that we would also get the level of affordability that we were looking for. So we know we need more housing at many different income types across the city, but we also know from the red burden charts and from the racial disparities that we have that just give more density across the city is not going to necessarily create more affordability. So this had to come in tandem with our inclusionary zoning policy, which was just passed at the end of the year and went into effect January 1st, 2020. And that's for our larger developments. So 20 units and more are now subject to our inclusionary zoning policy. So we knew that we want to make sure that we're creating an environment that we're continuing to create more supply, but we want to make sure that we're using our public policy to make sure that we're capturing some of that supply for the residents that really need it the most. So as Janet mentioned in her presentation this morning, and other people have talked about, there's the supply side and there's the demand side. So on the supply side, that's where the 2040 and the zoning changes, have really tried to change the regulatory environment, make it very consistent. So as Annalise was mentioning, it's not a negotiation every time. Developers know what it is. They know what the requirements are. They're able to work their performers around that. That will become more regular over time, and we'll be able to see what kind of impact that will have. But we also know that we have a responsibility at the city to increase our investment, because the supply side is not going to take care of it all by itself. So this has sort of been our strategy, is a pilot strategy. So we're increasing the dollars that are going to affordable housing locally, and we're piloting a lot of different things based on research that we've done, and a lot of things that came up through the community engagement through the 2040 plan as well. So this is a document that is actually not out for final public consumption yet, but I've got some pieces in here. And this is our progress report. So this is taking all of, sorry, I got my sheets mixed up here for a second. So this is taking all of the goals in the Minneapolis 2040 that are referred to affordable housing, and the work that we've already been doing, that our housing department and our community economic development planning department have already been doing to create affordable housing for our community, and really streamlining it into a comprehensive housing strategy. So all of the pilots, all the programs, all the initiatives that we do, we want to make sure that we're following our core housing values, which are advancing racial equality, expanding opportunity, preventing displacement, prioritizing our resources for households that are the most severely housing unstable, and developing sustainably. So from that, we have 7 strategies, and these look actually very similar to some of the other strategies that we've seen from other communities. So increasing the housing supply, diversity, and affordability in all neighborhoods. So that's where the 2040 policy comes into play, the inclusionary zoning ordinance, and we have a missing middle pilot that I'll talk about a little bit in a minute as well. Producing more affordable rental housing and preserving the affordable rental housing that exists, and making sure that those are subject to long-term affordability requirements. Preserving our unsubsidized, naturally occurring affordable housing that we have been losing rapidly over the last 10 years. Improving and sustaining access to home ownership, especially among low-income and Black and Indigenous people of color residents. Supporting our renters, preventing and ending homelessness, and maximizing the potential of publicly owned land to meet city goals. So there is a lot of information on this chart. I'm not going to go through it all, but it's something that since you all have access to this is where we really were, from a visual representation, you can see, so the left side is 30% AMI or below, and in Minneapolis that's around $30,000. So you can see the income levels go up as you go to your right. And then you've seen our programs and policies there, where we really map them out about what are our different programs and policies, what income level are they targeting, and when you can see them together, it creates a really good visual representation of where we're trying to prioritize our resources, where we might be falling short in prioritizing our resources, where we might need new programs. So we've really tried to map this out in a way where we can really have a holistic picture about what we're doing and the different strategies that we're trying to undertake. So none of that is possible without a budget, because all of those programs require funding. And as has been mentioned, we can't rely on the federal resources in a way that we would like to. In Mayor Frey's first budget in 2019, he included a record-breaking $40 million in affordable housing funding. That's 3 times higher than it's ever been, and that's just local dollars in Minneapolis. So that doesn't count our low-income housing tax credit, our home funds, any of that. And so the chart then that's here, this is with the 2019 budget, how it sorts out. So we have our affordable housing rental production. That's primarily our affordable housing trust fund, and those dollars are targeted at 50% or 30% of AMI, with a priority for 30% of AMI and a priority for 3-bedroom units. So we're really trying to prioritize those family size units and really trying to prioritize deeper affordability when we're using our affordable housing trust fund. Then we've got our homeownership programs, our renter support services. That's where we've really increased our funding to our local legal aid, so that renters can have representation in eviction court and hopefully before eviction court. And that's also where we support some of our rental support hotlines. And we've been able to expand their services to serve all 4 of the major languages that we have in Minneapolis. We have a big NOAA preservation fund where that's really where we've been targeting some of the bigger portfolios, where we know they're coming, that they may be coming up for sale, and creating a strategy with some of our other funders in the community where our money is leveraged with their money, and our nonprofit partners can be competitive in purchasing some of those bigger portfolios. Our affordable missing middle pilot, this is where we're trying to figure out, now that we've changed the zoning code to allow for these more diversity of uses, our policy is sort of ahead of where the finance industry is, to be quite honest. And so if we're gonna do that, we need to incentivize it. So it was a small pilot this year, where we were offering up to $70,000 per affordable unit. The whole development didn't have to be affordable, but the subsidy was only for the affordable units. And you had to prove that the project could not be done without the subsidy. So for $500,000, we had 21 applications. We were able to fund 3 of them through this program. They were just awarded last month at City Council, so they're just putting their other financing together and getting it going. So it's a very early on in the process. And then we were able to divert 2 of them to our sort of single-family home development, which goes up to 4 units. So we were able to fund 2 others through that. So that's where we're really sort of testing the model on some of these 3 to 6 unit developments in conjunction with our local City of Links Land Trust, who's doing some long-term affordability, and also our local Habitat for Humanity. I'm going to skip over prevent and homelessness for a moment. And then we have our stabilization pilot, which is really looking at those 1 to 4s. So the missing middle is more of the sort of 4 to 20, 20 and above is our NOAA preservation. How do we preserve? We have a lot of rental units in Minneapolis that are single-family homes or duplexes already. Those are much harder to figure out how to get your arms around how to preserve them. And then public land is where we're really trying to leverage our ability to buy land to do some land banking to create future affordability in places where our priorities. So the last thing I just want to highlight is this is one of our main initiatives for prevent and end homelessness. So our county, Hennepin County, does most of the homeless services. That's the way sort of our jurisdictions are divided up. But we are working on an initiative that we're very involved in the mayor's office. It's one of his sort of top priorities and initiatives, which is a collaboration between the county, the Public Housing Authority, the public school system, the YMCA, and then some of our funders, the Pullhead Family Foundation, who's a big philanthropic player in our community, to create housing and educational stability for students and their families through rental assistance and housing stability funds, and then also individualized support services. So I have to do a shout out here because we borrowed very heavily from Tacoma's program. So I know you're hoping to hear lessons learned from Minneapolis, but we've also been learning lessons from you guys, and the Public Housing Authority has been very gracious and open with their information. So we really took the program that they're doing here, and infused a lot of cash into it in Minneapolis, and are really trying to make a dent in student homelessness in a big way. We have around 2,500 homeless or highly mobile students in our Minneapolis public schools. So we've targeted the 15 schools that have the highest rates of homelessness. 70% of our homeless students are in those schools. So when you can imagine that like 1 in 5 kids in a classroom is homeless or highly mobile, the instability that creates not only for that child, but also for the entire classroom and the entire school. So we've really been targeting that. And sort of to circle back to how we're trying to put a racial equity lens over all the work that we do, we also know that our Black and Indigenous students are more likely to be homeless than the rest of our population. And we see that in the schools that have the highest rates of homelessness. So we're really able to target both our housing inequities and our education inequities, which we also see in a big way in a concentrated manner. So I could talk about a lot of other things, but I'm going to cut it there. Yes. Maybe I'll go back to this while we're waiting for questions. Anybody have any questions?
Thank you for that excellent presentation. I want to say that the gap between the white and the people of color income is very distressing, and certainly it's understandable that the housing follows suit with that. I was a bit inspired by the zoning change that converted single-family resident only to a triplex, if I understood that correctly. Mm-hmm. I know that's been implemented fairly recently, so perhaps there's not been time to determine what the outcome of that would be, but I'm curious if what happens to the purchase of the triplexes is that they become purchased by one person who then rents out the other 2 parts. If it becomes purchased by one person who uses it as an investment for air, bed, and breakfast rentals, which takes housing off the market for people that need it. Perhaps you have already regulations in Minneapolis that control that the owner must be on site if they do Airbnbs. Not everyone has that, of course. Or if it really does end up improving the home ownership, particularly rental, yes, but I'm really interested in home ownership because that's the equity for people of color.
So I can sort of answer and also sort of not answer that. So you're right, it's very early. We just changed the zoning. So we got a lot of press last year over the plan being approved at the end of 2018. We just passed the zoning changes in November of 2019. In that interim period, there were some folks who were trying to figure out how to make it work that started to work on projects knowing that that zoning change was going to come down the pipe. But we don't have a lot of information yet about how, what the uptake is going to be on that. We know it's not going to be substantial because there's a lot of financial limitations to people doing that. But I think our hope is that could be that it provides a lot of choice. So in our Minneapolis, we have a very large immigrant population. So maybe it's a multi-generational family that wants to live in multiple units that owns the building together. Maybe it's somebody who owns it and rents them out. Maybe they own it and rent them all out. In terms of Airbnb, we don't yet have an ordinance, but we have a couple council members who are working on an ordinance to regulate the short-term rental complications. So that's something that is in the works in Minneapolis to help to regulate that, especially in the context of knowing that we're creating the opportunity to have more of this type of housing. In terms of the sort of the equity gap in terms of home ownership, one of the things that we're doing that wasn't part of my presentation, but we have a developer assistance program. So with our home ownership development programs, we are also really trying to invest in our developers of color and making sure that they have access to those programs, that they have the technical assistance they need to grow their businesses so that they can participate in this kind of development. So we've really been trying to connect the access to capital and the technical with the affordability programs.
Michael Mayer at Tacoma Housing Authority. Thank you for your description. Minneapolis is inspiring. And thanks for visiting with us. Could you describe the inclusionary zoning program you started on January 1st?
Sure. There was an interim policy that was put into place, and then I'm just pulling up my notes here so that so we hired a consultant to help us work through that inclusionary zoning process because we wanted to make sure that it worked, that we were creating something that wasn't going to stop development, because if we stopped development, we wouldn't get any units, affordable units. So we were trying to find that balance. And one of our goals was to make it simple. And I will say that we failed at that goal. However, I think we have provided a lot of options that accommodate different types of development, different submarkets within our market. Oh, it's probably my phone. Developers can comply by producing 8% of their units affordable to incomes 60% of AMI or below, or 4% of project units with affordability levels at 30% of AMI or below. Both of those have a 20-year compliance period. Or developers can seek a city revenue loan offset financial assistance, in which the case is 20% of the units will have to be affordable at 50% of AMI or below, and that affordability is for 30 years. There are also a set of compliance alternatives, including a pay-in-lieu fee, producing units off-site, or donating land in the city to the city that the city could use for affordable housing in another place that is consistent with our goals for spreading affordability through different neighborhoods. So there's a lot of different options. And so the reason why we landed there was because we wanted to put a policy forward, but we also wanted to be able to really stick with the evaluation and see how it works. So we're putting a bunch of options out there. We're meeting consistently with the development community and trying to figure out what's working, what's not working. And our housing department is committed to coming back to our city council regularly with updates on how this is working and what who's choosing which option. Is that making sense? Are there loopholes we didn't think about that people are working around? Are there real barriers that we should consider addressing that are really halting development in the city? So wanting to have something that's predictable but still be flexible. So that's how we ended up with a very complicated but very comprehensive inclusionary zoning process.
Thank you. My name is Michaela Lemons, and I just had a question. I wanted to say I think it's wonderful that, first and foremost, you place the racial inequity at the forefront of your work that you're doing. And I kind of wanted to know more about the process of those 150 meetings. How did you, making the assumption that most of the population is white, how did you pull this over? Because my experience is that it's really hard to talk to white people about racial disparity.
Yeah.
So I don't imagine it was an easy process, but if you could kind of give us some feedback.
So I can give you some detail. I can also follow up and see if there's some document that I can provide that has some more detail from our long-range planning department. I actually joined the mayor's office after that process was over, so I can tell you what I know from the process. And I think a big part of it was this Mapping Prejudice project, honestly, that was already happening in the community. So there was already sort of a conversation bubbling, and we were getting this kind of press. This was from 2015, so this was right as we were starting to kick off this comprehensive planning process, where we were getting, these are both from the Atlantic, I believe. So they're from the same publication, and in February, they were calling us out for our inequity, and in March, they were talking about how great we are. So we were getting this really dissonant feedback from national attention. And I think it started a conversation, and some happenstance, and then also a commitment from the electeds and from a lot of the city staff who like sort of saw an opportunity to finally have a conversation that's really hard to have. And you know, there's still a lot of people who, there were people who were convinced by the process that this was the right thing to do. There are still people in Minneapolis who feel like they don't appreciate being called racist for being a single-family homeowner, which was not the intention. But also, you know, so I would say not everybody has like come along, but we had the political will to get there.
Hi, I'm Christina Hickok. I'm part of the City of Tacoma Planning Department, but I'm also trying to be a first-time home buyer, so I'm actually asking more on that side. I have lived and worked in a couple different places in the state, or in the country in different states, and in both cases I've seen this happening, and so I'm presuming you've had this problem too. In a lot of areas there are homes that below a certain rate, they're kind of expected to be the entry-level homes. Here in Tacoma, I've noticed it's around about $300,000. And as this affordable housing crisis has been happening, you have been getting either individuals or smaller LLCs that whenever a home comes on the market under that price, they're there with a cash offer that's $50,000 over the asking price within 24 hours. And you know, they're usually either flipping it and reselling it for twice the value they bought it, or they're just keeping it, and next thing you know, there's 5, 6, 7 homes that are all owned by this LLC and are being rented out. And some of them definitely take very good care of them. Some of them maybe not so much. But I'm mostly just wondering if this is a problem that you have experienced as well, kind of wiping out this entry-level home option, and if there's any recommendations you have.
Yes, so this is something we're seeing as well. So I think especially, pull up the map. So on the north side, we have seen a lot of that in particular because the housing values there were not as high as they were in some areas of the city. As our population growth increases and our new housing starts don't keep up with that, we're getting gentrification pressure across the city. And for a city of our size, it's very easy for that pressure to spread very quickly. And that community also got hit very hard by the foreclosure crisis. And then to add insult to injury, they also were hit by a tornado soon after that. So there was a lot of devastation and erasure of equity that occurred through both of those things. So we have seen a lot of that. I would say what we're trying to do after that, the city did have a pretty big was able to pick up a pretty big inventory of lots in the area. So the way we're trying to address it is more about our production of affordable homeownership, and we sort of come at it from two levels. So there's a subsidy to the home buyer to make it affordable to them, and there's also like a construction gap subsidy to say like the affordable price we want you to sell this at is less than what it costs us you to build it. So there's a subsidy for that as well in some of our programs. So we're trying to add to the stock in that way. I don't know, that's something we've particularly cracked. There was just an article yesterday that was not promising for this upcoming real estate season. Since we have the harsh winters, our real estate sort of goes dormant over in the winter. But buyers are back in force, and there's really very little stock available, especially at that under 300,000 level. We're seeing many, many multiple offers. I guess the other thing I would say is just in terms of as if they are being accumulated and then put on the market as rental housing, we're working with our regulatory services department to make sure that housing is good housing, is quality housing, is being managed well. It's one of the places where our Stable Homes, Stable Schools program is able to have some impact for larger families, because most of the new construction of affordable housing, if you can get a 3-bedroom unit, that's pretty good. But we're seeing some of our families in that program who are the most vulnerable have much larger family sizes, and so you can't fit a family of 10 into a 3-bedroom apartment. And so we're able to use some of those single-family rentals with our rental assistance to be able to provide that kind of housing that we can't in our new production programs. So that's sort of a roundabout answer. That doesn't really answer your question, but those are the ways we're trying to kind of come at it.
And I may be wrong in my recollection, but didn't Minneapolis accept a big refugee cohort at some point? Or am I confusing you
So
with
we
another city?
we have a pretty significant refugee population. We have a very large Somali community.
Right.
And we also, while our sister city in St. Paul across the river has more of the epicenter of the Hmong community, we also have a big Hmong population in Minneapolis as well. Those are our two sort of largest immigrant refugee populations, and we have some others as well.
Do you think those skewed your statistics at all, or would that you just didn't even consider that, or?
In terms of the growth,
Yeah, and having the homes available to meet the growth, the rapid growth.
so I think the large influx of the refugee populations happened sort of before we saw this really large growth. In terms of, it would have some impact, but statistically, the more of the impact is just that people have been moving to Minneapolis from cities that are less affordable because you can literally walk to a lake pretty much anywhere in Minneapolis. We have more jobs than we have people to fill them, which is unusual in the region, and it has been relatively affordable. So I think we got a lot of influx of millennials, to be honest, and that's been the main change.
Thanks.
Hi, I just had a question about like the movement that's been kind of going on with eco-friendliness and like millennial minimalist culture. I was wondering how your program was going to kind of like possibly compensate for that future in Colorado, maybe if they are doing that. I know in Tacoma specifically, we're kind of moving towards like more micro apartments and things like that, like the one that recently came up down the street over there. I was just wondering.
So we do have a sustainable, in our affordable housing division, we work with the green communities to do sustainability in all of our projects. There is a council member who's working on a sort of larger sustainability ordinance that will likely be in development this year. So it's definitely something that we pay a lot of attention to. We're very involved. My colleague in the mayor's office is very involved in the Climate Action Challenge. So we're doing a lot of work both in housing and other aspects of the city, and like our fleet and how we're incentivizing other kinds of sustainability efforts. We have a few specific programs. We have this program called 4D, which is very creatively named after the state statute that it's in, where it's what most sort of traditional affordable housing developments are able to use for a property tax break, where they're able, because they have a regulatory agreement, they're able to get discounted property taxes. We were the first city in Minnesota to be able to roll that out to try to address this smaller NOAA preservation. So now you can opt into that as like if you own a 4-unit building, you can opt in. 20% of your units have to be affordable, and at 60% of AMI, you have to commit for 10 years, and then you get a property tax reduction based on that. By opting into that program, you also get access to our Green Cross Share program. So you can make energy efficiency upgrades, solar panels. There's sort of a menu of options that you can participate in. So that way we're able to sort of couple both of those goals. So we're increasingly looking for ways where we can couple things together to provide incentives that are cost effective and also meet our climate and energy goals.
Well, please join me in thanking all of our speakers today. They provide a lot of information.